Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fox at Burwell. My name's Neil McGovern, and I'm a volunteer at the Cambridge Beer Festival. I'm delighted to be here and introduce a couple of people for tonight's beer tasting. We have Ricky Dolphin, who about 25 years ago started brewing, and then recently, just before lockdown, decided that his brewing ambitions need to be a little bit bigger. So what I can describe as a very large shed in his back garden to start brewing with Paul Belton here. And together they have formed Burwell Brewery. I've known Ricky for a number of years, but that's primarily when he was my flight examiner for my private pilot's license. He did fail me the first time, I should point out, but hopefully now my slight revenge when I can critique his beer. So hopefully everyone enjoy, and I'll hand you over to Ricky.
Thanks very much, Neil. So as Neil has said, we are live at the Fox in Burwell. Why the Fox in Burwell? Well, it's a free house, and that's really why we come and frequent it. I know that Bob has put on over 2,000 real ales since he took over the tenancy here. He's currently got about 4 different real ales on at the moment, including, of course, our own Burwell Sunshine, which we will be drinking this evening. So a little bit of explanation then about the evening. So we do have a live audience. I'm sure it will get bigger as we go through the evening. We'll be sampling our way through some British beers tonight. So I've selected 6 British beers. For those that are here in the room, we're sampling all of the beers from the Burwell Brewery, not surprisingly, shameless plug. There are also some glasses on the table for the people in the room. These are the Camera Beer Festival glasses. If you want to take them away with you at the end of the evening, if you can please pay £3 to Paul. That money goes straight to Bob because he's given us the room absolutely free to use. He would actually like to make some money. We're running till about 7 o'clock in here, but please feel free to stay longer. I'm sure that Bob will be happy to serve you all evening. So we're talking British beer. So I really want to start tonight by thinking a little bit about what is beer. Okay, so beer. When we talk about the term beer, we use beer in a generic fashion. So I describe beer using the acronym ALL. So if you think of beer as being all is ales. That's what we're drinking tonight. They are ales, and that's what British beer is. They're an ale. An ale is a beer that's actually made with yeast, which is top fermenting. So it's a particular type of yeast. They're fermented at around 20 degrees centigrade, and that gives us the variety and flavors we have of British beer. So that's the A in all. The next one is lager. We're all familiar with lagers. They pretty much have dominated the UK for some time, familiar with them throughout Europe. I have nothing against lagers, but it is only one type of beer, okay? So lagers are made with a bottom fermenting yeast. I mean that in the nicest possible way. So the yeast actually works and ferments in the bottom of the beer. The beer itself, when it's fermenting, is fermenting at a much lower temperature, so typically around 5 degrees centigrade, and it takes a lot longer to ferment because it's a much slower reaction. It produces much cleaner flavors, crisper flavors, and that's what we typically associate with a lager. So it may well actually take a month to ferment, and then it should be aged. Hence the term lager is from the German, so it's been lagered, it's been aged. So that's lager. The last one is the one we tend to forget. So we've got our ales, we've got our lambics, and then we've got our ales, our lagers, and then we've got lambics. That's the last L in all. So a lambic is beer made with a wild yeast, particularly popular in Belgium. They tend to be quite tart in flavor because that's what the wild yeast actually does. It gives tart flavors to the beer. And so it's not unusual that then they're sweetened using fruit, and hence you get different things like the framboise, which is adding raspberries into a beer and so on. But they add all sorts of different fruits to the beer to sweeten them up. And you'll find those particularly popular in Belgium, but actually making a bit of resurgence throughout the globe now, becoming more popular as sour beers in the UK, but also throughout the US. So our focus tonight is on British beer, on ales. We're going to be sampling 6, and I'm going to start us off tonight with brown beer. Okay, now then. This particular brown beer is what I've been wanting to introduce people to for a long time. Originally, all beer that was in the UK would have actually had this flavor to it. So when we actually make beer, we're making it from grain. That grain is malted, which means they start the germination process, which allows the sugars within the grain to be unlocked. And then what they do is they stop the germination. That's the malting process. Those sugars are then available. But what they can then do is they can then cook the grain further. And the more that you cook it, the darker that it gets. We'll talk about that as we talk about each individual beer. But in terms of the grains, originally, they would have been cooked or kilned over wood. There was nothing else. And because they were cooked over wood, it imparted a smoky flavor to the malt. And therefore, all of the beer that was made would have had a smoky flavor. So those of you who are watching online, if you've got a Newcastle Brown or a Man's Brown Ale, those won't have the smoky flavor, but they will be made with a brown malt. We're trying one tonight, which is actually made from a smoked German malt, which is called a Rauch, which is the German for smoked. That's the one on your tables, which has the gold lid on it. It's unlabeled at the moment. So if you just want to take your bottle opener, which should be on the table, and open it up, Paul, if you want to open one up for me, because I'd hate to be dry all evening. And this is the first one we're going to sample. So if you're at home and you're sampling a beer, it's a brown ale. If you just want to pour a bit into a glass for me. Thank you very much. So as we just look at the beer, if you look at the color of it, the way we sample beer then is we're looking at the color. What I'm looking for when I open up a beer is I'm looking at whether or not that beer is true to the style. So because this is a brown beer, I'm expecting it to have a sort of caramel tinge to it, a sort of browny, tawny color, which it does. If you swirl it around the glass and give it a good sniff, you should really smell smokiness in the glass. And then if you drink that, you should get caramel flavors. And then as you swallow the beer down, you get the smokiness that comes at you. This beer is fantastic if you have it with smoked cheeses, meats, anything like that. Absolutely fantastic to have. It's an absolutely great beer, very difficult to get hold of in this country, except from specialist beer shops. But we produce it in the brewery, and we produce it simply for the fact that we love it. So good reason to produce your beer, but a really good example of a typical brown beer. Now, the reason why I've done this one first is because it is quite a strong flavor. But if I don't give you this one first, then you won't understand what's about to follow. So I want you to imagine as you're drinking this beer, this is all that's available to you, is a smoky flavor to your beer, whatever the color is, whether it's a darker beer or not, okay, because the malt's been cooked longer. That's it. That smokiness is in all of your beer. and then the Industrial Revolution happens. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution happens, and suddenly there is coke available, coal available. You have now smokeless fuels that you can now use to kiln your malt. The problem is that's very expensive. Okay, there's not a lot of it around, and what is around is expensive. So the people that basically are drinking beer, they're all drinking this particular beer, which is fantastic beer. And then what happens is, and we're going to take the first of these malts. Actually, Paul, if you pass me one of those over, one of the pale malts. This, if you can see it, this is pale malt. Okay. Now, this pale malt, you can actually put it in your mouth. You can eat the malt. Nothing wrong in eating it. It will taste a bit like Weetabix. So you can take a pinch and eat it. This is pale malt. This is the base of all British beers. Okay, they'll use this pale malt. You can get extra pale malt and pale malt, and you use this in the base of your pale ales, your IPAs. In fact, every single beer we are drinking tonight has in it as a base malt this pale malt. Okay, so this is produced, it's cooked over a smokeless fuel, and if you taste it, it's not smoky at all. It gives you this lovely malty flavor like a scoop of Horlicks, and there's no smokiness in it at all. Okay, but it was an expensive malt at the time. So the first beers that were produced would have been a pale ale, and that's what we're going to try next. We're going to try a pale ale. So for those of you who are sitting there thinking we've got 6 beers to do in an hour, my recommendation is, okay, have a small amount in the bottom of the glass because you're going to be drinking at least one every 10 minutes, okay? You can always come back and take your favorites and polish them off for the rest of the evening. So we're going to open up the one with the orange lid if you're drinking with me here. Burwell Sunshine is the next one. Now, in comparison to what you've drunk, the Burwell Sunshine is probably going to taste flavorless, okay? Because it doesn't have that really smoky flavor. Oh, Paul's got a live one. That's extremely lively. Okay. Is it okay? Okay. So we're going to be drinking a pale ale. So if you're at home, open up a pale ale. What you'll notice about it, of course, is it's pale in color. That's what it should be. It's a pale ale. What you should notice about it, you'll have to find me another glass, Paul. You should notice about it as well as you swill it around the glass and sniff it. You know, you don't get very much off of it particularly. It's not particularly strong in aroma. It's not even particularly strong in this example in flavor. But it is very pale in color, almost lager-like. Swilling it around. It's what I'd call it. They've actually got it on at Burwell Sunshine at the moment. It kind of really doesn't have a great deal of flavor to it, particularly. Now, you can do different styles, so you can actually build up the size. You can add more hops and so on. But it really is what I would call a quaffing beer. It's the sort of thing you know, it's very mild, and I'm using that term deliberately. It's very mild. It's not bitter. You know, after we've had the Rauch full of flavor, you drink this, you swallow it, and you think, did I have, you know, there's not a lot to it. So it's pale, but it's very clean in flavor. And so you've got to imagine the contrast now between drinking your Rauch and drinking a pale for the first time. This is an incredible beer because of its cleanness, and you know, it's just so very, very different to anything that's gone before. Okay, so that's typically a pale ale. Yep. We actually sell a lot of Burwell Sunshine. And if I'm trying to introduce somebody to British beer, if you've got somebody who's a lager drinker, you can't get them drinking anything but lager, introduce them to pale ales. Don't introduce them to an IPA. Introduce them to a pale ale, because it's quite similar to a lager, very easy to drink, very mild. In terms of bitterness, we measure bitterness by EBUs or IBUs. Now we've left the EU, we'll have them as IBUs, international bitterness units as opposed to European bitterness units. IBUs, okay, so the IBUs of this one are only about 15. It's really very mild. Now then, mild, if you've got any mild at home, if you open up your mild and you drink it, you'll find it's very similar to the pale ale. It doesn't actually have any particular bitterness to it. You swallow it, and as you swallow, you taste bitterness at the back of your mouth. So when you swallow a beer, that's when you actually get the bitterness and experience that. And we're going to experience that in the next beer here, which is Margaret's Field, which is an IPA. So if you want to open up your IPA, silver top to the IPA. We'll pause in a minute. They might have been, they have been shaken on the way down here, undoubtedly. Yeah. So whilst that's there, I'm going to tell you the story of IPA. Okay. So, IPA. If you look at this and think about the pale ale, this is not so pale. Yeah. It's got a golden color to it. Yeah. That golden color has come because we've taken the pale malt and we've added crystal malt to this. So on your tables, for those of you here, you'll actually see there is some crystal malt. So it's much darker in color than your pale malt. It's been cooked for longer. And if you taste a bit of this one, it's not the real black one, it's the one in the middle. Okay, this one here, okay, is going to be more bitter, more caramelly. All right. When we add crystal malt into a beer, it adds caramel flavors to the beer. It adds darkness to the color. So the longer we cook the malt, the darker the malt gets. And then when we add it to the beer, it makes darker beer. Remember that when we come to the porters and the stouts, because that's where we'll be talking about chocolate malts and black malts. Okay, so that's crystal malt. And so our IPA that we brew has some crystal malt in it, and that helps give it this color. So IPA, how does IPA differ then in comparison to a pale ale? What's the difference? Well, if we look at the pale ale and sniff it, it has, you should get off of this one, you should get citrusy notes from this. Yep, it's a much stronger hop aroma to it. So what you're picking up when you sniff a beer, best way to actually sniff a beer is put your hand over the top of the glass, swill the glass around, take your hand off, and then sniff the beer. Glasses like this are ideal for it. So if there's a tulip shape, they're ideal for getting the aromas of your beer. And you should, in this example, get citrus type aromas that come off of it. When you taste this beer, it's an IPA, okay? It should have a good bitterness to the finish. So when you taste the beer, initially you'll pick up sweetness, then you can swill it around your mouth and you can ask yourself, is it a thick beer or is it a thin beer? The pale ale was really thin. It just kind of, you know, you swill it around your mouth and you disappear. It's not at all syrupy. It just kind of disappears down, and after you've swallowed it, it's gone. That's it. Whereas with this one, it's a little bit thicker, which we call the mouthfeel. And as you swill it around and swallow it, you get a bitterness to the flavor. So those of you at home, if you're opening up your IPAs, you should actually get good bitterness when you swallow them. Now, why is that, and what's an IPA? So an IPA is an India pale ale or an Indian pale ale. Where on earth did India creep into this? Well, the answer lies in the spice trade. You've got to remember, we've got an expensive malt. and you're looking for a market for that malt. Now, sure, there's some people here in the UK who can afford to pay for that, okay? But all of the wealth, of course, is coming from the spice trade at this time. A lot of that is coming in from India. You've got people making a lot of money out in India. And what is happening is you've got boats that are going out to India without anything on them. They're filling up with ballast. So they're putting rocks in these boats to give them the ballast, to sail them around to India, offloading the ballast, filling them up with spices, and bringing these heavily laden ships then back full of spices, and then sending them back empty again. What you really want, there's a business opportunity here. We can actually load them up with a beer, which will then mean basically you've got a nice heavy ship going out there. We've got people over in India who are businessmen, they're traders. You've got the East India Company. There's money there. So we can sell this product at a premium price because it's a premium price to produce it. But there is one small problem, is you've got a 6-month voyage out there. I need beer which is going to keep. So to make it keep, what you need to do is make it strong. So it should be high in alcohol, in excess of 5%. And you need it to have lots of hops in it because hops have antiseptic properties. They will help keep the beer. So the more hops you put in it, the longer it's going to keep. So that particular beer style was developed as high in alcohol, lots of hops in it. Hops, if they're added early on in the boiling of the wort, so that's when you're making beer, one of the final stages before you go into fermentation is the boil. When we add hops in the early stages of the boil, it adds bitterness. When you add hops late stage in the boil, it adds predominantly aroma, even to the point at which, with things like Margaret's Field, we are adding hops after the beer has finished the boil. We let it cool to about 80 degrees, and then we add the hops, because what we don't want to do is destroy any of the hop oils. We don't want to drive off those hop oils, because it's the hop oils which give it the aroma. And that's what you're drinking here. That's what you can smell is the hop oils. The longer you keep the beer, the more the hop oils will then begin to evaporate. But so the younger beers, you'll get those hop oils. So a good IPA will be in excess of 5%, should have really good bitter finish to it, should have plenty of aroma, plenty of flavor to it. That's your IPA. So I'm just going to take a little break. Any questions from anybody in the audience? Any questions from anybody? Okay, any questions from anybody online at this point?
Actually, Ricky,
Yeah, Ali.
we had the Burwell Sunshine, and we've been drinking the Burwell Sunshine here, which was cask ale, and now we've been drinking it bottled here. And there's quite a distinct difference between it.
Absolutely.
Do you brew them in a different way to go in bottle or keg or cask?
Yeah. There is always a difference between bottled beer and cask beer. The reality is once we put it in the bottle, what we're not doing with our beer is we don't pasteurize it, we don't artificially carbonate it. Which, of course, for Canberra and Real Ale, the moment you pasteurize your beer, the problem with pasteurizing, it's great for long shelf life because it's going to kill everything in the beer. So it's now a dead product. It's not going to change. And that's what you want for long shelf life. So if you pasteurize your beer, the problem with pasteurizing it is when you put it into the bottle, there's now no live yeast in it, and therefore it's not going to build up its own natural carbonation. So when yeast feeds on sugars, a byproduct is carbon dioxide. That's what happens when you bottle beer when it's live. By live, it actually has yeast in it that is still alive, and therefore it will carbonate. It will continue to feed on the residual sugars. So when you keep the beer in the bottle, what happens with a bottle-conditioned beer is it continues to feed off of the residual sugars, and so it will get drier. It will get slightly more acidic over time as those sugars disappear, so the residual sweetness will begin to disappear. And of course, it will increase slightly in strength. And so the flavor of a bottle conditioned beer will change over time, whereas the cask beer doesn't do that. It's still a live product, but it actually goes into the cask from a conditioning tank rather than straight from the fermenter into the bottle or straight from a conditioning tank into a bottle. So there are subtle differences between the two. And the way you serve cask beer as well, of course, changes the flavor, is the short answer. Another question I can see.
It's related to what you just said. How long would a bottle of Margaret's Field last for? I've got some in my garage.
Okay. Yeah. So the question is, how long would a bottle of Margaret's Field last for? That is a really difficult. About 30 seconds. Yeah. So it's a difficult question to answer simply because in order to make the beer last as long as possible, you want to minimize the amount of dissolved oxygen in the beer. So ideally, what we'd be doing would be filling the bottles using a counterflow system where actually you initially purge all the oxygen, all the air out the bottle with carbon dioxide, and then you fill it with the beer without exposing it to any air. That type of equipment is quite expensive for somebody of a brewery of our size, upwards of £10,000 for just a small unit. What we do is we actually have a little thing called a beer gun that we fill them with carbon dioxide, and then we use the same gun to fill them with beer, and then we top them with carbon dioxide and we put the lid on. So what we're trying to do is minimize the carbon dioxide uptake. You shouldn't have any problems in 3 months, providing preferably the beer should be kept dark and cool. After 3 months, it's going to be changing that time. After 3 months, it will begin to deteriorate. By 12 months, depends on the strength of the beer, but something like Margaret's Field, it's probably going to be all right, but it's not going to be the same beer that it was 6 months ago or 12 months ago. Yeah. So generally, yeah, you're doing well if you can keep it that long, of course. But
I know.
It certainly won't do you any harm.
Yep. Okay, so I've got a question. What's my favourite beer style and why? Okay. I actually really like IPAs. I quite like citrusy IPAs. But actually, the beers that I drink vary depending upon the season. Yeah. So in the summertime, I will drink more IPAs, citrusy beers. I will drink more wheat beers. As it gets colder, I switch. So sort of autumn time, I might switch then into drinking more bitters, which we'll come to in a moment. So I'm drinking darker beers, stronger beers, more flavorful beers. As we go into winter, I will switch into porters and to stouts, maybe into some Belgian beers. So you're something that's really strong and flavorsome. You're not looking for something that's thirst quenching. You're looking for something that's full of flavor and warming. And then, of course, we go round to spring, and you can get 4 seasons in one day, as we've had throughout May. It's been freezing cold, and so I've been sitting there drinking porter and stout through May. But so yeah, what's my favorite style? As you can tell, that does depend on the season. I really like, I like Belgian beers. I like full flavoursome beers. I'm not a great fan of pale ales because I find, for my palate, they're a little bit insipid. I like something that's a bit more hop forward in the summer and a bit more rich and flavoursome in the winter. But it's personal preference. Okay. All right. So we've learnt about IPA. So we've come from a Rauch that was smoked, full of flavor, and you can get that real contrast between the pale ale and then the contrast again between the pale ale that was very mild to the IPA, which has quite good bitterness. I haven't pushed the bitterness up to like 70 EBUs. The bitterness of the Margaret's Field is only around about 45 EBUs. It's not a really bitter IPA, but there are plenty, particularly the American style IPAs, can really push that up to 70, 80, even 90 EBUs, and you'll really get that in the back of the throat as you swallow them. We're going to switch now into British bitters. So a British bitter, by the name, it's a bitter. So if you're at home, crack open one of your bitters. If you're here, so it's the befuddled bitter. Now, by the name bitter, you would expect it to have some bitterness. All right. So when we look at a British bitter, what you're basically looking for is you're looking in terms of flavors. You're expecting the color to be a sort of golden, deep caramelly color. That's very typical for a British beer. Bitter. If I get a bitter and it's absolutely pale, I think it's wrongly classified. It should be a pale ale, maybe even an IPA. But there's a lot of crossover between styles. So you get something like Timmy Taylor's Landlord, they'll refer to it as a pale ale, but actually, is it a pale ale or is it a bitter? So I look at it and basically say, well, okay, this is our befuddled. It's a nice golden color, which I think is very true to a bitter. Yeah, there's some residual sweetness in there. So in terms of flavor, what I'm looking for in them, again, bottle conditioned beers tend to be more heavily carbonated. What I'm looking for in the flavors is there, as I swallow it, is there a bitterness there? Is there a sort of biscuity, caramelly flavor that comes from our crystal malt? Is there any bitterness there as I swallow? And what sort of strength? Well, I'd expect it now depends on what's your bitter. So when we go into a bar in the UK, you might ask, can I have a pint of your best bitter? Yeah. What do I mean by best bitter? What do I mean by ordinary bitter or special bitter or extra special bitter? There's all of these additional terms which have been put onto the beer. And the answer lies in the way in which we can make beers. So when we're making in the brewery, we will make different grades of bitter. We will make one which is called slightly befuddled, one which is called befuddled, one which is called double befuddled, and one which is called absolutely befuddled. Yeah. They are all different strengths of beer, but they are all the same basic recipe. So what are we actually doing? Well, there are two different ways in which you can make beer of different strengths. The first way you can do it, okay, is the way they used to do it, which is when you're actually going in and making the beer. The first stage of beer is like making a cup of tea. So you take the grain and you steep the grain in hot water. Typically, you're looking to add water at what's a strike temperature of about 77 degrees centigrade, because as it hits the colder grain, it's going to cool. And we're looking then to brew this concoction at 65 degrees centigrade. The reason why we're looking for 65 degrees centigrade is because we are balancing alpha amylase and beta amylase to break down the starch in the grain. So within the grain, sugar, you get starch. Starch is made up of a long chain of glucose molecules. Okay, I'm going to keep it simple. And there are lots of chemists in the room, I can tell. So what happens is as the amylase begins to break those starch chains down, okay, you get glucose, you get maltose, you get maltotriose, and you get residual dextrins. The temperature that you actually do this, what we call mashing at, affects the way in which it breaks down and how much residual dextrins you get left. Also, time has an impact. The longer you do it for, the more those starch chains break down. So you may be thinking, well, surely I want to break those starch chains down as much as possible. No, you don't. Because if you do that, you end up with mainly glucose and not much of the other sugars. Glucose, the yeast, will quite happily convert that glucose into alcohol, but it's not going to produce much else. It just completely converts it. And so what you end up with is a beer that's really thin, and basically, yeah, it's high in alcohol, but it really doesn't have any body, any mouthfeel. So as you put it into your mouth and swill it round, it's very thin. It's a thin beer. Very common in home brew with excessive mash times, or low, the temperatures aren't consistent, or the temperatures are too low, you get this very thin beer, and it's just not very pleasant. Okay, so 65 degrees. Now, why have I told you all of this? Because once we've let it in there for an hour, we start running it off. So we're now running off the liquid. So that water has now absorbed all the sugars, and we've now got a caramelly liquid, tastes like Horlicks. Okay, and that first runoff is incredibly sweet because it's got all of the sugars in it. That's your first runoff. Now, the way they used to make beer, they don't do this anymore, but you can run the whole lot off, put it to one side, and then you can fill the pot with water again, leave it for a while, run it off. That's your second runoff. Then you do it again, your third runoff. You can then do it again, your fourth runoff. Each time that the amount of sugar in the resulting liquid is getting less and less, the beer's getting thinner and poorer quality. That gives you lots of different grades of beer from exactly the same set of grain, until eventually, of course, you'll get a very tannic, very insipid, bitter liquid that's pretty awful. Okay, you want to stop before you get there. But the previous ones, you can then ferment those as separate beers to give you different grades of beer. That, of course, will give you a different price point to your beer as well, because the first one is the really good quality, high in alcohol because of the sugars in it, full of flavor, really good mouthfeel. It's your premium beer. That's your extra special bitter. The next one down is your special. Your next one down is your best. Then you get to your ordinary, and then you get to the stuff that, frankly, you should have thrown out. Yeah, okay. So it was not unusual to go into a pub, and behind the bar would be all of these different grades of beer. And you bought the beer that you could afford. So to go into the bar and say, I'll have a pint of your best, landlord, basically, yeah, well, he would serve you the best beer, the best bitter that he had. But it would also not be unusual for the landlord to actually blend beers to suit your pocket. So you'd go in there, well, I don't want to drink the cheapest beer, but I can't afford, the most expensive beer. So could you put a little bit of the most expensive one and some of the next one grade down, so I can get something that actually matches my pocket without actually drinking the really cheap stuff. Now, we still have a trend of at least throughout the 70s, not so much anymore, but of blending. If you wanted, well, I have a pint of mild and bitter. Yeah, I'm not talking about a snake bite and black here. Okay? So we still have a trend of actually blending different beers to get different flavors. It's quite an interesting experiment to do. Now, the way we do it in the brewery now is actually we brew a high-strength beer, which is our absolutely befuddled. And then basically you can then take that final product when it's fermented and you add brewing liquor. This, of course, is a very clever marketing term for treated water. So you then add treated water at the end to actually dilute the beer down. I did a test with some of the guys from the camera committee when they came round of these different grades of beer and got their feedback on them, because actually what I wanted to know was, if I get right the way down to my slightly befuddled, is it actually drinkable? Well, actually, yes, it was. They're looking at me at horror now. What? The slightly befuddled. So, you can add more water. We do treat it. You want to, first of all, you've got to get rid of the chlorine, because otherwise you get a lot of metallic flavors in the beer. So, yes, we will treat the water. We're not just adding tap water to it, but we are diluting the beer. And it's absolutely fine to do so. So we will dilute it down with treated water, and that gives you the different grades of beer. The other way we can do it, of course, is you add less malt in the first place, and basically then you get a weaker beer. So the befuddled that we're drinking today was actually made to a specific recipe to produce a 4% beer. I didn't produce a 6.5% beer and dilute it down. Okay, so that's British bitter, really the mainstay of a lot of the beers that we get when the market isn't completely swamped with your IPAs, as it traditionally is. Okay, so the trouble with talking is you don't actually get to drink. I want this one. So we've gone through to some of our darker beers. We're now going to go through to this stuff. This last piece of malt that I brought in here, and there are more than 3 malts, by the way. There are lots of different malts. This is black malt. So take a pinch if you're in the room. Take a pinch of your black malt. Yeah. And as you chew it, you think that's quite bitter. Yeah. You're kind of getting some chocolate flavors probably from it. Some bitterness that comes from it. Yeah. Yeah. But look at the color. That color, if you add that into your beer, will very quickly give you a dark beer. You use it with caution in brewing. Use too much, you get a beer which is just far too bitter and horrible and very dark. We actually use this in our befuddled. Befuddled is actually made from pale malt and then a few spoonfuls of black malt. I kid you not. We do use black malt. So black malts, chocolate malts, darker malts are used in porters and stouts. So we're going to move on now to a porter. So I've got a few questions coming in. So if you want to open up your porters, the porter is the Judy's Hole. It's a chocolate porter. So I've got a few questions I'm going to answer that come online. Why do they taste different if you leave it out for a while in the air? Well, there are 2 things going on. The first one, of course, is the carbon dioxide is actually being driven off, which then basically is changing the flavor profile of the beer. The second thing is it depends how long you leave it out for. It's oxidizing. And as it oxidizes, the flavors change. If you get a red wine and you take a red wine and they recommend you open the red wine, you let it breathe. In other words, you let it oxidize, which helps the flavors to develop. Okay? So with a beer, I always find if I open a bottle of beer, it's not unusual for me to open it, pour it into the glass and leave it for a while to let the CO2 settle down and get rid of some of it so I can really taste the beer. Because as the CO2 goes over the tongue, it's masking some of the flavors. It's kind of reducing the surface area on the tongue. So what I like to do is just leave it open for a while, pour it into the glass, let some of the CO2 evaporate, and then I actually drink it. I'm fussy, I know. Okay, so the porter. Okay, I've got another question. I've got a question. Is there a difference between porter and stout? And I'm going to come to that in a moment. So, yep. Okay, I've got another question coming here. What's the most important ingredient in beer? What gives it the most flavor? The answer to that is the malt. Okay, it's what we call the grain bill. So the malt that we actually put in, that we've actually been passing, we've had some of it on the table and we've been chewing it. That's what actually gives beer its base color and its flavor. Then you add the hops, and the hops is the next component. Depending on the hops, will give it its bitterness and the different flavors in terms of aromas. Okay. Okay, I'm getting lots of questions, but I'm going to introduce you to Judy's Hole, and then I'm going to answer some more questions. So, Judy's Hole. All right. So, the first thing you notice about this is it's dark. And it's dark because of the chocolate malt and crystal malt and black malt that goes into this, as well as roasted barley. Okay? So, it's a dark beer, which is what you'd expect. And so when you taste it, you get a bit of residual sweetness. And then this one is our summer variety. This one is only 4.5%. So in terms of mouthfeel, it's not as thick as the winter version. It's a little bit easier to drink in that respect. By easier to drink, I mean it's easier to quaff it by the pint. You wait till you get to the Red House. You won't be quaffing that by the pint. So this one's, again, it's designed to be easier to drink. It's rich in flavors because of the chocolate malts and the roasted barley. And then as you swallow, it's got a bitter back taste to it, which comes again from those dark places around the country. So most of you be familiar with IPAs, and pale ales brewed in Burton-upon-Trent because of the water they had there was most suitable because of the salts that are found in the water up in Burton-on-Trent, actually were ideal for making pale ales. The water down in London is very hard water, and the salts and the natural balances in the water there made it particularly suitable for making dark beers. Now, when you can't strip your water back and chemically treat it, when you can't do analysis, you just have to use what's there. You make a beer that actually is a good beer based upon the water that you have available, which is why dark beers such as stouts and porters were actually tended to be made in London, and the pale ales tended to be made up in Burton-upon-Trent. Now, bearing in mind now where this beer, this porter, this dark beer is made, it's made in London. You've got all of this shipping trade that is coming into London, up the Thames, into the docks. All of that has to now be unloaded and taken to various different warehouses and various deliveries around London. And the people that are taking it are porters. There was an army of porters when a boat landed. Some of the porters had licenses and were the only people who were permitted to take goods where duty had to be paid on it. So there would be some of those porters. There were more general porters who would take other goods and so on. And they would take it all around the city of London. It is hard work. You're lugging this stuff. You know, if you are lucky, you can take a horse, but a lot of this stuff is just being lugged by people on their backs or on trolleys around London into the warehouses or into the vendors who are going to sell it. And basically, as you're doing that job, you are burning the calories and you are getting thirsty and you're getting hungry. So what do? You stop off at a pub on the way, you have a few quick beers, you then pick up your load, you continue on the way. And the beer they're drinking is a dark beer, and hence the dark beer got the name after the people who were drinking it, which is the porters, hence London Porter. So that's what a porter is. Should be a dark beer, and it shouldn't be really bitter. That's where you get into stouts. It also shouldn't be really strong. If it's really strong, you don't want to drink it if you're a porter. You've got a job to do. So you want something that's quite quaffable and easy to drink, that's full of flavor, and that's where you get a porter from. So a good traditional porter, dark in color, should have roasted chocolatey notes to it, should be fairly easy to drink, with a reasonable bitter finish, but it's not excessive. Sorry?
How strong is this?
4.5%. Yeah. But my 4% is about where most of our beers start. It's actually quite difficult to brew a good quality beer at under 4% because you start getting into issues of very thin beers with poor mouthfeel because they begin to taste quite watery. I mean, the Burwell Sunshine is, it's a thinner beer. It's designed to be a quaffing beer on a hot summer's day. Drink it cold, So whereas this, no, it's got a bit more flavor to it. It's a bit more power to it. That's our porter. Okay. Yes, one more question. Go on.
If 4.5% was relatively weak, what were the strong beers?
Yeah, indeed. This is where we can talk about Robin Hood and his merry men. Originally, British beers would have had a strength of 11-12%. They would have been really, really strong beers, okay? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, basically beer duty. As duty has been introduced on beer, that then affects basically the resulting product. And so the strength of beer varies depending upon how much duty is being levied by the government. At the end of the day, you've got a market and a price point to hit. And if I've got to pay more money to the government, then I basically, one of the ways I can do that while still maintaining the quality of the beer to a point is you say, well, actually, if I make a weaker beer, I pay less duty, I reduce the price to me, which means actually I can hit the price point to the consumer. So, most of the beers that you drink today are somewhere between 3.5% and say 5.5%. That's pretty typical. But those are very weak in comparison to what they used to be. Another question, go ahead.
So when water wasn't very drinkable,
Yeah.
As people, agricultural workers, used to drink small beer
Yes.
with everything instead of water. How strong is that?
Yeah, the small beer would have been weak. It's table small beer. So that probably anywhere between say 2.5% to say 4%. You're looking at something that's quite quaffable. Yeah. So table beer or small beer tends to be much lighter in alcohol. Okay, I've got a few more questions online, and then I'm very conscious time is ticking, and I need to get on to some stout. So, where does beer yeast come from, and are there different varieties, and do they produce different flavors? Where does it come from? Well, I can't tell you where it originally came from, but it has been refined over time. So most of it comes from specialist producers, and what happens is that a brewery gets usually will get a yeast originally from one of these yeast producers, and what they will do with that is they will then make their beer, and whilst they're making the beer, they will then skim off some of the yeast if it's a British beer from the top, but equally, if you have conical fermenters, you can actually take it off it's not the middle of the beer, it's the bottom of the beer, but it's not the very bottom. You take it off from about halfway up the conical section. And you take that yeast off, it's still live, and you take it off into a sterilized container. You feed it with either a sugar solution or you feed it with a bit more beer. You keep it alive and you pitch it into the next brew. So when we are brewing back to back, it's not unusual for us to take the yeast off the previous brew and pitch it back into the next brew. What happens over time is that the yeast then adapts to the type of beer that you're making, and so you get yeast which is unique to the brewery, and that then becomes a bit of a trade secret. Okay, so you basically end up with beer with a particular yeast unique to the brewery, and so they will actually harvest the yeast and they will keep that yeast alive for generations. It becomes something where they actually, like a seed bank, they will send samples of that yeast off to somebody to store it because it is extremely valuable to the brewery. Most of our yeast comes from basically a particular producer. We buy dried yeast, which we then rehydrate, just like a home brewer will. We will rehydrate it. There are lots of different strains of yeast. There's a British ale yeast that we tend to use, Saf Ale SO4, but there are different ones we use. We use in our wheat beer. We use one which is a specialist for wheat. For the Belgian milk stout that we're going to have, we use a different type of yeast. So there are lots of different types you can use, and they all come from different types of producers, and they all have different flavors to them. So last question, and then I'm going to go on to stout, is where do we buy the malts from? We are in the malting region of the UK. So Norfolk, Suffolk, big malts. There's all around. If you look to the fields, you'll see barley. Okay. We actually buy ours from Crisp up in Fakenham. We get it delivered. I think it's the half ton. We get about a half ton of grain delivered. That's the minimum they'll deliver. So we buy about 500 kilos. Well, it is no less than 500 kilos of grain every time we buy it. Sits in Paul's garage, and then we lug it over to the brewery when we brew. But that's where all our malt comes from. Our hops comes mainly from Charles Farram, who are over in Herefordshire. So two big hop growing regions in the UK are Kent and Herefordshire. Most of ours comes from a supplier in Herefordshire, but the hops come from all over the world, not just British hops, but New Zealand hops and American hops as well. Okay, so we're going to finish up on stout. As the name suggests, stout is a strong beer. That's all stout means. It's a stout beer. It's strong. So your stout ought to be a strong beer. One we're trying here from the brewery is an 8% beer. Yeah. This particular one, as well as being made from chocolate malts and from black malt, this also has in it cacao nibs, vanilla, bourbon, Yeah. So we soak the cacao nibs in bourbon, which both sterilizes them and infuses them. And then we use those in the beer, which imparts the chocolate notes to the beer, as well as the richness that comes from the bourbon. We also add Madagascan vanilla pods into it. And then we leave that lot to infuse. Now, as you can imagine, it's quite an expensive beer to produce. But you know, some things are worth it. And so this is the one we produce at an 8% beer. We only do it in 33 centiliter bottles, simply because it's an 8% beer, and you don't want to drink it by the pint. A wine glass of it is quite sufficient. It's a beautiful dark color. If you swirl it around the glass, you'll find it sticks to the side of the glass. So it's quite a thick, almost syrupy beer. Yeah. So the mouthfeel, you'd expect the mouthfeel to be quite thick, quite chewy. Yeah. And then as you drink it, you should get that rich chocolatey notes in the mouth. So initially you get that sweetness, fairly thick as you swirl it around your mouth. As you swallow it, you get those chocolate notes coming through. You may get a hint of vanilla. People tell me they can actually go ahead, and if they sniff it, they can actually sniff and get vanilla notes from it as well. This actually has been quite a popular beer. We only brew it once a year. But that's what you're looking for in a stout. If you get a stout, frankly, that's 4%, it's really not very stout. Okay? So stout, you know, we think of stout as being Guinness. Yeah? Now, but Guinness, okay, Guinness is a relatively strong beer, but it's, you know, what are we talking? It's 4 point something these days. It's a bit, they've diluted it down. It's really quite bitter. Most people tell me they don't like stout, they don't like dark beers, because they once tasted Guinness and it was far too bitter for their palate. That's not stout, that's just an example of stout. And so it's surprising that when we introduce people both to Judy's Hole and now to the Red House Stout, that people really say, actually, I don't drink beer, but that's really nice. Okay, so again, if you're not a beer drinker, go ahead and try some of these richer, chocolatey beers. You could suddenly find you become a beer drinker, but drink them by the wine glass. Okay. I think we are now just about 7 o'clock. I don't know if we've got time for any questions or we need to sign off, but any other questions for me? Sorry?
What about the byproducts? So we talked about the produce we talked about now. What about byproducts? What do you do all the grains in your
Yeah.
and stuff?
Okay. So the question that I've been asked is, what do we as a brewer do with all the byproducts when we've been brewing? Well, all of our grain, once we've brewed with it, goes to a local pig farmer. It gets fed to the pigs. That's not unusual. And yeah, the hops, we're working with a local mushroom grower at the moment. The hops apparently are quite good because of the acidity to go into soil, so they make quite good compost. So we're working with a mushroom farmer at the moment who's developing compost from the hops. And yeast, although not from us, we don't really produce enough. Yeast goes to make Marmite. So all of the byproducts from brewing actually can be reused into products. I'll take one more question, and then we'll close for the formal session.
So Ricky, in Germany and the Czech Republic and places like that, they tended to go for lagers, whereas in Britain we've gone for ales. Is there any reason for that, or was it just like they did it their way and we did it ours?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is climate. Originally, it's climate. So again, obviously, northern Germany, you know, the northern latitudes, we can grow grain. Once you go too far south, you're into grape territory. So that gives you a sort of a wine versus beer divide. Other than that, yeast types and temperature, in the summer it's quite hot. But if you go into Germany, they do dunkels, wheat beers, you know, full of flavor and so on, not so much lagers. Lagers are a relatively recent invention because of the yeast. But I think, you know, mainly it's dominated simply because of, you know, I think from temperatures, really, it's much warmer in Central Europe than it is over here in the summer, and therefore people have tended to drink cleaner, crisper beers that can be served cold, and lager, because it's fermented cold, can be brewed cold, can be drunk cold.
Could I just suggest that one of the reasons for not brewing lager here was because of the duty laws, because you had to pay the duty up front, and the lager took so much longer.
Yeah. It is also true that it's actually very expensive to make good quality lager, because it takes no less than 4 weeks to ferment it, and at least the same again to condition it. It makes an expensive product, for sure. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand back to Neil to close the session.
Okay, thanks very much, Ricky. Huge thank you for coming along and giving us not only a description of different styles of British beer, but also a history lesson about how they came along as well, which was fantastic. Just want to say a huge thank you to Gearset, who've sponsored things like all of our glasses. So they have been made available to the pubs for free, and then therefore the funds, which can either go to charity or to the pubs to help support them. They've also helped supporting with things like the live streaming and making sure this works, and Cambridge Beer Festival. We have some more events at the Cambridge Beer Festival online. So tomorrow we have Becky and Ben Ackers, who are a wonderful duo who are both a chef and have managed and run various pubs. So they're going to be doing a Saturday kitchen type food with various beers and matching of that. And also tomorrow we have Simon Gibson from Simon Cider, who's going to be running through various cider tastings as well. And as always, got loads of events that are coming up on behalf of Cambridge Camera and Cambridge Beer Festival. If you follow us on social media or on our website, then all the details are on there. So huge thanks for everyone for coming along. It's been fantastic. Thank you again to Ricky, and hopefully I'll see you online, and hopefully, fingers crossed, next May on Jesus Screen for the next in-person Cambridge Beer Festival. Thank you very much.